Arthur Miller was the neighborhood nut in Oakhaven, a man who spent 40 years digging a hole while his neighbors built pools. They laughed at his concrete tomb for decades until the mercury hit -80 degrees and the screaming stopped. This is the day the laughter finally froze. The town of Oakhaven, Montana, didn't just dislike Arthur Miller, they treated him like a living, breathing, cautionary tale. To the local realtor, Brendan Walsh, Arthur was the man tanking property values with the industrial-grade air filtration pipes sticking out of his backyard like rusted periscopes. To the town's mayor, Diane Sterling, he was a persistent legal headache who ignored every zoning ordinance regarding subterranean fortifications. Arthur didn't mind the whispers. He was a man of 72 with skin like weathered saddlebag leather and hands that never quite lost the scent of diesel and wet earth. While the rest of the village spent their summers hosting lavish barbecues and their winters skiing the slopes of the Bitterroot Range, Arthur was moving pallets of canned peaches, medical-grade oxygen tanks, and thousands of gallons of fuel into a hole that went 40 feet deep. "Building another room for your imaginary monsters, Artie," Brendan Walsh would shout from across the fence, holding a glass of expensive Cabernet. "You know that concrete money could have bought you a condo in Boca. You're going to die in a basement while the rest of us are enjoying the sun." Arthur would just pause, wipe the sweat from his brow with a greasy rag, and look at the sky. It wasn't the monsters he was worried about. It was the silence. He had studied the atmospheric shifts, the slowing of the Gulf Stream, and the erratic behavior of the jet stream for half a lifetime. He didn't see a beautiful Montana autumn. He saw a pressure cooker waiting to pop. The warning signs. The shift began on a Tuesday in late October. It started with a bird, a cedar waxwing that dropped dead out of the sky and shattered like glass on Sheriff Miller's cruiser. Then came the dogs. Every canine in Oakhaven began to howl at 3 a.m., a primal, mournful sound that set everyone's teeth on edge. Arthur felt it in his marrow. The barometer on his wall wasn't just dropping, it was crashing. He walked to the local general store, owned by a skeptic named Gary Higgins, to buy the last of the salt and kerosene. "Going to be a chilly one, Artie?" Gary smirked, leaning over the counter. "The news says it's just a standard Canadian front. Maybe a foot of snow. Nothing a shovel can't handle." "It's not a front, Gary," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The polar vortex has fractured. We aren't getting a storm, we're getting the North Pole. If you have a basement, seal it. If you have a fireplace, stack your wood inside the house today. Not tomorrow. Today." Gary laughed, a loud, booming sound that drew the attention of Sarah Jenkins, a young mother of two who was picking up milk. "Artie, you've been saying the world is ending since 1994. My kids are tired of hearing your generators hum at night. Give it a rest." Arthur looked at Sarah, at her thin designer jacket, and the toddlers in her cart wearing nothing but light sweaters. He felt a cold knot of pity in his stomach. "Sarah, bring the kids to my place by sunset. I have extra bunks." Sarah rolled her eyes and walked out. "I think we'll stick to our central heating, Arthur. Thanks anyway." The descent. By 4 p.m., the sky turned a colour no one in Oakhaven had ever seen. It wasn't grey or black. It was a bruised, sickly violet. The temperature, which had been a comfortable 45 degrees Fahrenheit at noon, plummeted to 10 degrees Fahrenheit in less than an hour. Arthur didn't wait for the official emergency broadcast, which wouldn't come anyway, because the cell towers were the first things to snap under the sudden atmospheric pressure. He retreated to his backyard, unlocked the 3-ton steel hatch disguised under a shed, and stepped into the airlock. He spent the next hour performing his final checks. Asterisk geothermal exchange. Active. Asterisk hydroponics. Stable. Asterisk fuel reserves. 5,000 gallons of stabilized diesel. Asterisk air scrubbers. Calibrated. As he bolted the final interior door, a vault-grade slab of reinforced steel, he heard a distant, high-pitched whistling. It sounded like a freight train made of ice. It was the sound of the wind picking up speed, transitioning from a gale to something more predatory. The snap. At 6:12 p.m., The power grid of the Pacific Northwest didn't just fail, it physically disintegrated. The sudden drop in temperature, now reaching -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and falling, caused the high-voltage lines to contract so violently they snapped their towers. In the Walsh household, Brendan was trying to restart his designer gas fireplace when the windows simply exploded inward. They didn't break, they shattered into dust because the pressure differential between the warm house and the flash, freezing outside air, was too great. "Diane! Get the blankets!" Brendan screamed, but his breath didn't come out as steam. It came out as ice crystals that scratched his throat. Down in the bunker, Arthur sat in his worn leather armchair, a bowl of hot soup in his lap. The sensors on his console were screaming. The external temperature probe was reading -65 degrees Fahrenheit. Then came the first thud. It wasn't the wind. It was something heavy hitting the hatch 40 feet above. Then another, and another. Arthur looked at his CCTV monitors, which were encased in heated protective glass. Through the swirling white chaos of the flash freeze, he saw shadows. The people of Oakhaven were no longer laughing. They were at his door. The ethical Moor. Arthur watched the screen. He saw Gary Higgins, the store owner, pounding on the steel plate with a crowbar. Gary wasn't wearing a coat. He had been caught in his shirt sleeves, and his skin was already turning a horrific, waxy white. Behind him, Sarah Jenkins was huddled in the lee of the shed, clutching her 2 children. They weren't crying anymore. They were too cold to cry. Arthur's hand hovered over the hydraulic release. His bunker was designed for 4 people to live comfortably for 5 years, or 10 people to survive for 2. There were currently 30 people gathered above his hatch in the killing cold. If he opened it, the blast of -70 degrees Fahrenheit air would flood his upper chambers, potentially seizing the inner seals. If he let them all in, his CO2 scrubbers would fail within weeks. If he stayed silent, they would be dead in 10 minutes. Brendan Walsh crawled toward the camera lens, his eyes wide and clouded with the onset of hypothermia. He mouthed one word: "Please." Arthur Miller, the man they had mocked, the man they had tried to sue out of his own home, felt a tear prick his eye. It was the last bit of warmth he would feel for a long time. He reached for the intercom. The airlock only holds 6 at a time. Arthur's voice boomed through the external speakers, barely audible over the roar of the frost. "If you crowd the hatch, the sensors will lock, and no one gets in. Line up. Children first. If you fight..." I'm turning the cameras off. The struggle for survival had begun, but the cold was a faster runner than any of them. As the first group descended, Arthur looked at his thermometer. -82 degrees Fahrenheit. The village of Oakhaven was already gone. It was just a graveyard of ice now. And Arthur Miller was the only one with the keys to the mausoleum. The airlock hissed, a sound like a dying gasp, as the first 6 souls tumbled into the decontamination chamber. Among them were Sarah Jenkins and her 2 children, their small bodies shivering so violently they seemed to be vibrating. Arthur watched through the reinforced glass of the inner door, his face a mask of grim determination. He waited for the sensors to confirm the external hatch was sealed, and the temperature had stabilized to a balmy 20 degrees Fahrenheit before opening the secondary vault. "Inside! Move!" Arthur barked, discarding the role of the neighborhood hermit for that of a drill sergeant. Sarah fell to the floor, her fingers blue and hooked like talons. She couldn't speak. Arthur ignored her for a moment, grabbing the children Tommy and Lily and shoving them toward the heat vents. He stripped off their frozen jackets, which were as stiff as sheet metal, and wrapped them in wool blankets he'd kept warming on the radiator. "Gary! Get her up!" Arthur commanded. Gary Higgins, the man who had mocked Arthur's imaginary monsters only hours ago, stumbled in behind them. He was missing a shoe. His left foot was a ghostly, translucent white. He looked at Arthur with hollow eyes, the arrogance of the town's businessman replaced by the raw, animal terror of a prey species. "There's more of them, Artie," Gary wheezed, his lungs burning from the supercooled air he'd inhaled. Brendan is out there. The mayor. She's in her car. In your driveway. The glass blew out. She's not moving much. Arthur looked at the monitors. The scene outside was a nightmare rendered in shades of blue and white. The wind was now sustained at 110 miles per hour. This wasn't just a cold wave, it was an atmospheric collapse. The ozone drop he had feared, where the vacuum cold of the upper atmosphere sinks to the crust, was happening. He saw Brendan Walsh. The realtor was huddled against the steel bulkhead of the shed, his expensive cashmere coat useless against the negative 90 degrees Fahrenheit wind chill. Brendan was looking directly into the camera, his lips frozen in a silent prayer. Arthur's hand trembled on the lever. He had enough food for 20 years for one person. With 30 people? They would be out of supplies in months. The oxygen scrubbers were rated for high efficiency, but 30 panicked breathing bodies would tax the lithium hydroxide curtains to their limit. Cycle the lock again, Arthur whispered to himself. He brought in another 6. Then another. Each time he opened the outer hatch, the bunker groaned. The temperature in the entry hall plummeted, ice forming instantly on the interior concrete walls. By the time the 4th cycle began, the people outside were no longer standing. They were a pile of shivering humanity, trying to use the heat of the dying to keep the living warm. The last entry. The final person to be dragged in was Mayor Diane Sterling. She had been found by Brendan, who had surprisingly found a spark of heroism in his vanity, dragging her from her stalled Mercedes. When the inner door finally slammed shut and the deadbolts engaged, the count was 22. 22 people in a space designed for a family of 4. The silence of the bunker was broken only by the sound of ragged breathing and the distant, muffled scream of the wind 40 feet above. The village of Oakhaven now consisted of 22 people in a concrete box, and whoever was lucky enough to have a deep cellar and a mountain of wood. "Arthur!" Brendan gasped, clutching a mug of broth Arthur had forced into his hands. The others, the Millers down the street, the Henderson kids, they didn't make it to your yard. Arthur didn't look up from his control panel. "I know. We have to go back out. We have to check the neighboring houses," Diane Sterling said, her voice shaky but regaining its authoritative edge. "As mayor, I'm ordering a search and rescue." Arthur turned, his eyes cold enough to match the storm. "Diane, look at that gauge." He pointed to a digital readout connected to an external thermocouple. "It huntel autographes." "At that temperature," Arthur said slowly, "carbon steel becomes brittle. Your lungs would blister and bleed after 3 breaths. The spit on your tongue would freeze and crack your teeth. There is no Oakhaven anymore. There is only this hole. And if you touch that hatch, I will put a bullet in you myself to save the 21 people who aren't suicidal." The reality hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah Jenkins began to sob, a low, broken sound that echoed off the concrete. They weren't just guests. They were survivors of an extinction event. 2 weeks passed. The world above was silent. Arthur's external cameras had finally failed, not because of the electronics, but because the snow and ice had buried the shed entirely. They were under 20 feet of frozen drift, sealed in a tomb of their own making. Inside, the social fabric of Oakhaven was tearing at the seams. The bunker was a marvel of engineering, but it wasn't built for the ego of Brendan Walsh or the bureaucracy of Diane Sterling. By day 10, the community council had formed, and by day 11, they were arguing over the rations. "We can't just eat canned beans and vitamin paste," Brendan complained, pacing the narrow corridor. "I have a stomach condition. And why does Arthur get the master cabin? It's the only room with a real bed." "Because he built it, Brendan," Sarah Jenkins snapped. She had become Arthur's de facto assistant, helping manage the hydroponic garden that provided the only fresh oxygen and greens they had. "He saved your life. He saved my kids." "He saved us for what?" Gary Higgins added, looking at his bandaged foot. 2 of his toes had been lost to frostbite. amputated by Arthur with a bottle of whiskey and a sterilized scalpel. To watch us starve? He's got a locked storage room in the sub-level. I saw it. There's meat in there. Real meat. Arthur watched them from the shadows of the mezzanine. He saw the shift in their eyes. Gratitude has a very short half-life when the belly is empty and the air is stale. The sabotage, the breaking point came on day 18. Arthur was woken by the sound of a struggle in the machine room. He grabbed his sidearm and ran down the metal stairs to find Gary and Brendan trying to force the lock on the Special Reserves door. "Move away," Arthur said, his voice a low growl. "No more secrets, Artie," Gary yelled, his face flushed. "We're all in this together, right?" "That's what you said. Why are you hiding the good stuff?" "I'm not hiding good stuff, you idiot," Arthur said. "That room houses the backup CO2 scrubbers and the seed vault. If you break that seal, you'll contaminate the sterile environment. We need those seeds for when the thaw comes, if it ever comes." "He's lying," Brendan cried. "I smelled bacon coming from the vents yesterday." The crowd of survivors gathered at the entrance of the machine room. Panic and hunger had turned them into a mob. Diane Sterling stepped forward, her face pale. "Arthur, for the sake of transparency, show them what's in the room. If it's seeds, we'll back off. But you can't keep us in the dark." Arthur looked at the faces people he had known for decades. He saw the desperation. He knew that if he opened that door, he would lose the last bit of leverage he had to keep them disciplined. But if he didn't, they would tear the bunker apart. He stepped aside and punched in the code. The door hissed open. There was no meat. There were no luxuries. There were rows of plastic-sealed containers and a secondary generator that was humming quietly. But in the center of the room, there was a small glowing screen showing a live feed from a deep-buried satellite uplink Arthur had kept secret. The screen showed a thermal map of North America. The crowd went silent. The map wasn't blue. It was a deep, necrotic purple. The cold wave hadn't just hit Montana. It had reached as far south as Mexico City. The entire electrical grid of the United States was a black void. "There is no help coming," Arthur said into the silence. "There is no National Guard. There is no Red Cross. The atmosphere has shifted. This is a great filter event. We aren't waiting for a storm to pass. We are waiting for a new ice age to stabilize." The turning point. The revelation broke the mob's spirit, but it ignited something worse in Brendan. He realized that in this new world, money and property meant nothing. Only the bunker mattered. That night, while Arthur slept, Brendan made his move. He didn't try to steal food. He tried to take the keys to the armory and the main control console. He believed that if he controlled the life support, he controlled the people. Arthur was alerted by a silent vibration in his pillow, a fail-safe he'd installed years ago. He met Brendan in the dark of the hallway. No words were exchanged. Brendan swung a heavy pipe wrench, catching Arthur in the shoulder. Arthur didn't flinch. He'd spent 40 years preparing for the worst of humanity, not just the worst of the weather. He tackled Brendan. The two men crashing into the hydroponic trays. "You're going to kill us all," Brendan screamed. "You're a hoarder. You're playing God." The commotion woke the entire bunker. As the lights flickered on, the survivors saw their hero, Brendan Walsh, pinning the man who had built their sanctuary, a shard of broken glass held to Arthur's throat. "Give me the master codes, Artie," Brendan hissed. "I'm running this now. We're going to ration based on utility, the sick and the old. They're just wasting air." Sarah Jenkins stepped out of the shadows, holding Arthur's discarded pistol with trembling hands. "Get off him, Brendan." "Sarah, honey, put the gun down," Brendan smirked. "I'm doing this for us. For your kids. Arthur is too soft. He'll let us all starve out of morality." "Arthur gave my kids his own rations for the last 3 days," Sarah said, her voice turning to steel. "I saw him doing it. He's been eating half portions so Tommy and Lily could have extra." "You?" You stole an extra bottle of water yesterday. I saw that too. The rest of the survivors moved in. It wasn't a riot, it was a judgment. Gary Higgins, despite his limp, was the first to grab Brendan's arm. The price of exile. Arthur stood up, clutching his bruised shoulder. He looked at Brendan, then at the hatch 40 feet above. You want to be in charge of your own destiny, Brendan? Arthur asked. You can't throw me out, Brendan whimpered, the bravado vanishing as he realized the room had turned against him. It's murder. You're a murderer if you put me out there. I won't put you out, Arthur said. But you aren't staying in the living quarters. There's a storage crawl space beneath the floorboards of the airlock. It's cramped, it's cold, and you'll have to hand pump the grey water filters 10 hours a day to earn your calories. You want to survive? You're going to work for the people you just called waste. As Brendan was dragged away, Arthur looked at the thermal map on the screen. The purple was deepening. How long, Arthur? Diane Sterling asked, her voice small and fragile. How long until we can see the sun? Arthur looked at the data. The nitrogen levels in the upper atmosphere were finally beginning to rebalance, but the sheer thermal mass of the ice above them would take months, maybe years, to recede. The sun is still there, Diane, Arthur said, sitting back at his console. But for now, we have to learn how to be a village in the dark. We have to be better than the world that froze over. Outside, the wind roared at negative 110 degrees Fahrenheit, scouring the remains of Oakhaven from the face of the earth. But deep beneath the frost, a small red light flickered the heartbeat of a civilization that had been too proud to listen, now forced to learn the value of a man they had called a fool. By the 6th month, the bunker had ceased to be a shelter and had become a microcosm of a new civilization. The walls, once cold and imposing, were now covered in drawings by Tommy and Lily, vibrant crayon-coloured suns and green trees that didn't exist anymore. The air always smelled of damp earth and recycled ozone, a scent that Arthur Miller had grown to associate with the fragile persistence of life. The social hierarchy of Oakhaven had been completely inverted. Brendan Walsh, once the man to prove a $100,000 car, was now the pump man. His hands, formerly manicured, were calloused and stained with grease. He lived in the crawl space, emerging only under supervision to perform the grueling manual labor required to keep the waste systems from freezing solid. He was no longer a villain. He was a ghost, a reminder of the ego that the cold had killed. Arthur, meanwhile, was failing. The physical toll of the flash freeze and the subsequent months of stress had thinned his frame. He sat at the command console, his eyes shielded by thick glasses, watching the data streams. The external thermocouple had finally risen to a balmy negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The atmospheric pressure was stabilizing. The ozone drop had passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean of everything that wasn't anchored to the bedrock. Arthur, you need to sleep, Sarah Jenkins said, placing a hand on his shoulder. She had become the bunker's primary medic and botanist, her instincts for nurturing children translating perfectly to the care of delicate hydroponic sprouts. The ice is shifting, Sarah, Arthur whispered, pointing to the sonar readings. The weight on the hatch is decreasing, the drifts are sublimating, turning straight from ice to gas because the air is so dry. We're going to see the surface soon. Is there anything left to see? She asked, a question that had haunted every survivor for 180 days. Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. The breach. On day 212, the sensors registered a sudden, violent change. It wasn't a drop in temperature, but a surge in light. One of the high-altitude cameras, encased in a diamond glass housing Arthur had spent a fortune on years ago, finally cracked through the ice crust. The monitor flickered to life. The room went silent as the survivors gathered. It wasn't the Montana they remembered. Oakhaven was gone. The houses had been crushed by the weight of 30 feet of ice and the sheer force of 150 miles per hour winds. Only the jagged skeletons of chimneys remained, poking out of a flat, white wasteland that looked more like the surface of Europa than Earth. But there, On the horizon was a sliver of gold. The sun was breaking through a sky that was no longer violet, but a deep, piercing azure. "We're going up," Arthur announced. His voice was no longer a growl, it was a benediction. The process took 3 days. They had to use industrial heaters to melt the ice surrounding the outer hatch and hydraulic jacks to force the steel plate against the compacted snow. When the hatch finally groaned and swung open, the air that rushed in wasn't the killing frost of the initial wave. It was cold, stinging, -10 degrees Fahrenheit cold, but it was fresh. It tasted of nothingness and rebirth. The resurrection. Arthur was the first to climb the ladder. He emerged into a world of absolute blinding white. He stood on the roof of his shed, which was now level with the new ground. He looked toward where Gary's general store had been. There was nothing but a mound of snow. He looked toward the mayor's office. Gone. One by one, the 22 survivors climbed out. They stood in a circle on the frozen sea of Oakhaven. Brendan Walsh was the last to emerge. He squinted at the sun, tears freezing instantly on his cheeks. He looked at Arthur, not with malice, but with a profound, shattered humbleness. He reached out and touched the sleeve of Arthur's heavy parka. "You were right," Brendan whispered, "about everything. I would have rather been wrong." Arthur replied, looking at the horizon. They weren't the only ones. Far to the west, a plume of smoke rose from the base of the mountains, another survivor, another bunker, another spark of humanity. The world had been reset. The vanity of the old world, the property values, the politics, the petty grievances had been buried under 30 feet of ice. Arthur looked at Sarah, who was holding her children tight. He saw Gary, leaning on a makeshift crutch, looking at the remains of his town. "We have work to do," Arthur said. "The seeds in the vault. They're designed for a shorter growing season. We have the tools. We have the knowledge. And for the first time in Oakhaven's history, we have a community that actually knows how to survive." The legacy of the fool. As the months turned into years, the story of Arthur Miller's bunker became the foundation of the new Oakhaven. They didn't rebuild on the old sites. They built into the hills, using the earth as insulation. They honored the man they had once called the prophet of concrete, not as a king, but as a teacher. Arthur Miller died 3 years after the thaw, his heart finally giving out in the warmth of a spring day that reached 50 degrees Fahrenheit. He was buried not in the ground, but in the heart of the bunker he had built, which had been converted into the village's library and seed bank. Above his resting place, a plaque was installed, commissioned by Brendan Walsh and Sarah Jenkins. It didn't list his name as a hero. It simply read, "To the man who built a hole so that we could see the sky." The village of Oakhaven had been wiped out, but the people had been saved. They were no longer the skeptics who laughed at the storm. They were the survivors who respected the silence. And every year, on the anniversary of the flash freeze, the children of the village would gather at the old steel hatch and listen to the story of how a man's madness became the only thing that didn't freeze. The cold wave had taken their homes, their history, and their pride. But in the darkness of the earth, it had given them something they never had in the sun: a reason to depend on one another. Arthur Miller's story is a chilling reminder that the line between crazy and prepared is often just a matter of degrees. In a world of unpredictable shifts, are you the one laughing or the one building? If this story of survival and redemption moved you, don't let the message freeze. Like this video, share it with someone who needs a wake-up call, and subscribe for more incredible true-to-life dramas.